Working the late shift at Mario's Pizza last winter, I answered what seemed like a routine delivery call that would haunt me forever. The caller's voice was unnaturally monotone as he ordered 2 large pepperonis for delivery to Riverside Apartments on Oak Street. Despite delivering pizzas for 3 years in this town, I never heard of any apartment complex called Riverside on Oak Street. Loading the steaming pizzas into my insulated bag, I noticed a white van parked suspiciously across from our shop's entrance. The 20-minute drive through empty suburban streets felt eerily quiet, with only my headlights cutting through the October darkness ahead. Arriving at the given address, my headlights revealed nothing but an empty dirt lot surrounded by rusted chain-link fencing. I called the customer back, and that same eerily calm voice apologized repeatedly before providing a completely different address nearby. The corrected address led me to what looked like a house from every horror movie I'd ever seen in theaters. Every window was sealed with weathered plywood, weeds choked the driveway, and no vehicle was anywhere to be seen. Standing on the sagging front porch, I knocked loudly on the peeling door, but heard absolutely no response from inside. When I tried calling again, the phone number had mysteriously been disconnected, sending chills racing down my spine immediately. Walking back toward my car, I spotted that same white van now parked strategically across the street watching me. My blood ran cold as I realized this vehicle had been following me since I left the pizza shop earlier. Racing back to work, I immediately told my manager everything while we both watched that van circle our building. The police revealed this phone number was connected to 6 attempted armed robberies targeting unsuspecting delivery drivers like myself. Selling my old laptop on Craigslist seemed like easy money until this buyer turned my life into a nightmare. This guy messaged me about the laptop and insisted he needed to see it in person before making any decision. Against every instinct telling me otherwise, I agreed to let him come over to my house that afternoon. When he arrived, something felt immediately off about this guy, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He barely glanced at the laptop for maybe 30 seconds before claiming he needed to get cash from his car. I waited by the window but watched him drive away completely without ever coming back to buy anything. That evening, I had to work the night shift, leaving my house empty and vulnerable for hours. When I returned home the next morning, my front door was still locked, but something felt terribly wrong. Nothing was actually stolen, but it was obvious that someone had carefully searched through all my personal belongings. My dresser drawers were barely closed, papers were moved around, and everything seemed slightly out of place somehow. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut when I connected the fake buyer to this. He had never intended to buy the laptop at all, just wanted to case my house completely. This creep had memorized my schedule and figured out exactly when the house would be empty and unprotected. I installed security cameras immediately and never again let strangers know where I live or when I work. Road trips are supposed to be fun adventures, but sometimes you end up in places that feel straight out of horror movies. I was driving cross-country when this massive storm hit out of nowhere, turning day into complete darkness within minutes. My GPS completely died in the storm, leaving me totally lost on these creepy backcountry roads with no signal. After driving aimlessly for hours, I finally spotted the neon sign of an old roadside motel through the rain. The place looked frozen in time from the 1970s, with faded paint and only 2 other cars in the parking lot. I had no choice but to check in for the night, even though every instinct was screaming at me to leave. The desk clerk was this strange guy who asked way too many personal questions about my travel plans and destination. He kept asking whether anyone knew exactly where I was, which made my skin crawl with unease and paranoia. My room was just as outdated as expected, with musty carpet and furniture that belonged in a different decade entirely. Around midnight, I started hearing footsteps slowly walking back and forth right outside my door for hours on end. Then someone actually tried turning my door handle multiple times, testing whether it was locked or not somehow. I spent the entire night wide awake, sitting in that chair, watching the door and listening to those sounds. The moment sunrise came, I grabbed my stuff and got out of there as fast as humanly possible. I never found out what those people wanted, but I definitely wasn't sticking around long enough to discover their intentions. Camping alone in the Washington wilderness seemed like a perfect escape until something sinister started unfolding around my tent. The first night passed without incident, giving me false hope that this solo adventure would be peaceful and uneventful. Morning arrived, but when I stepped outside, my blood ran cold at the sight of multiple footprints surrounding my entire campsite. Someone had been walking around me while I slept, investigating my tent from every possible angle throughout the night. Worse still, several packages of my food supplies had been opened, and portions were completely missing from my pack. I tried to convince myself it was just wildlife, but the footprints were unmistakably human and deliberate in nature. That second night, I lay in my tent pretending to sleep when I heard multiple voices whispering in the darkness outside. Flashlights began moving around the woods, illuminating trees and brush systematically as if searching for something specific out there. I realized with absolute horror that there were at least 3 or 4 people deliberately surrounding and watching my campsite closely. They weren't just passing through randomly, they were intentionally observing my tent and studying my every movement and reaction carefully. Without any light or sound, I silently gathered my essential gear and slowly unzipped my tent with trembling hands in absolute quiet. I crawled out and crept into the forest, moving away from my campsite as quietly as humanly possible into the pitch-black wilderness. I could hear their footsteps behind me, moving through the brush as they seemed to follow my direction through the darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached the main trail and saw the ranger station lights, finally feeling safe from whoever was hunting me. Day hikes are supposed to be refreshing adventures, but sometimes they turn into nightmares that haunt you for years afterward. I decided to tackle this challenging trail I'd never explored before, thinking it would be a perfect solo adventure challenge. Everything seemed fine until I realized somewhere along the way I'd taken a completely wrong turn and was totally lost. The sun was starting to set behind the mountains, and panic began creeping in as darkness approached the forest rapidly. That is when I started noticing really disturbing things that made my skin crawl with fear and absolute confusion about this place. Trail markers had been deliberately moved from their original positions, clearly designed to confuse and misdirect other hikers like myself. Strange symbols were carved deep into tree bark, looking fresh and intentional, like some kind of sinister territorial markings or warnings. Hidden behind thick brush, I discovered temporary campsites that looked recently abandoned, complete with disturbing personal belongings scattered around carelessly. The worst part was hearing footsteps and branches snapping behind me, like someone was deliberately tracking my every movement carefully. Every time I stopped to listen, the sounds would stop too, confirming that someone was definitely following me through these woods. I picked up my pace dramatically, trying to find the main trail before complete darkness trapped me in this nightmare wilderness forever. My heart was pounding as I pushed through thick vegetation, branches scratching my face while something pursued me relentlessly through darkness. Just when I thought I was completely doomed, I finally spotted the familiar main trail markers glowing in my flashlight beam. I made it out safely, but I'm absolutely convinced that someone had been hunting me through those woods all day long. My friends and I thought exploring an old abandoned house would be a thrilling adventure we'd never forget completely. The house sat isolated in rural countryside, surrounded by dense woods and overgrown vegetation that hadn't been maintained in years. From outside, it looked completely empty and abandoned, no signs of life or recent human activity visible anywhere on the property. But the moment we stepped through that creaking front door, we knew something was seriously wrong with our assumptions about this place. Fresh garbage was scattered throughout the rooms, and cigarette butts were still smoldering in ashtrays on various tables and surfaces nearby. Open food packages showed no signs of spoilage, meaning someone had definitely been eating and living here within the last few hours. We exchanged nervous glances, realizing our assumption about abandonment was completely wrong and potentially dangerous for our safety immediately. That is when we heard something that made our blood run cold, distinct footsteps moving across the ceiling upstairs directly above our heads. The footsteps continued deliberately, as if whoever lived here was casually walking around their own home without any concern or care whatsoever. We realized in absolute horror that the house wasn't abandoned at all, and someone was actively living upstairs watching us from above. Without any hesitation or discussion, we bolted toward the front door as fast as humanly possible to escape the dangerous situation immediately. We burst through that door and sprinted across the overgrown yard without looking back once, adrenaline fueling our desperate flight to safety. Later, we discovered the house was occupied by squatters, involved in serious criminal enterprises and dangerous illegal operations throughout the building. We realized we could have been seriously hurt or worse if we hadn't left when we did from that terrifying, dangerous situation. Abandoned mining towns scattered across Nevada hold dark secrets that most visitors never expect to encounter during their explorations. I decided to explore one of these forgotten places that everyone claimed had been completely deserted for decades. The old wooden buildings stood like skeletal remains against the harsh desert landscape, perfect subjects for my photography collection. I was completely absorbed in capturing these haunting images when something made me look up from my camera viewfinder immediately. Two shadowy figures stood watching me from a considerable distance, positioned strategically behind some crumbling stone structures near the town's edge. They maintained enough distance that I couldn't make out their faces or any identifying details about their appearance clearly. As I moved through different areas of the town, these mysterious watchers consistently followed my every movement with disturbing precision. Every single time I turned to look directly at them, they would instantly vanish behind buildings or large desert rocks. This unsettling game of cat and mouse continued for nearly an hour, making my skin crawl with increasing paranoia. The psychological pressure became unbearable, and I decided it was definitely time to get out of there as quickly as possible. As I drove away from the cursed place, my rearview mirror revealed a distant vehicle beginning to follow me. The mysterious vehicle maintained a considerable distance throughout my drive, never getting close enough for proper identification of the occupants. They followed me for miles along the empty desert highway before finally disappearing into the vast Nevada wilderness. I still wonder who those people were and why they were so interested in keeping tabs on visitors to their territory. Working late shifts at McDonald's can be pretty boring, but what happened that night still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was manning the fryer station when our regular delivery truck dropped off what looked like a completely normal batch of frozen fries. The boxes looked exactly the same as always, same packaging and labels. Nothing seemed unusual or different about this particular shipment at all. But the moment I dumped the first batch into the hot oil, I knew something was seriously wrong with these fries. Instead of the usual satisfying sizzle, these fries started making the most disturbing sounds I've ever heard from food before in my life. It sounded almost like screaming, high-pitched and unnatural, echoing through the empty kitchen in a way that made my skin crawl completely. Even weirder, some of the fries were moving around in the oil like they were swimming or trying to escape the fryer. They twisted and writhed in patterns that made no sense, definitely not following normal laws of physics or cooking behavior whatsoever. I immediately called my manager over to witness this insane situation, but he just laughed and thought I was playing pranks. He told me to stop fooling around and get back to work, completely dismissing what I was seeing with my own eyes. But then, customers started returning their orders, complaining loudly that their French fries were somehow still moving on their plates. Parents were freaking out as their kids screamed about dancing fries, and the situation quickly spiraled completely out of our control. We had to throw out the entire shipment and refund everyone's money while trying to calm down the terrified customers that night. To this day, I still have no explanation for what happened with those cursed fries that defied everything I know about reality. Strange things happen at fast food places late at night, but what went down at our McDonald's was beyond anything we could explain. We had this mystery thief who kept breaking into our kitchen, but they weren't interested in cash or equipment like normal burglars. This person only wanted freshly made burgers, somehow knowing exactly which ones had just come off the grill that evening shift. Our security cameras would catch glimpses of movement in the kitchen, but the footage was always frustratingly blurry and completely useless. No matter how many times we reviewed the tapes, we could never make out any identifying features of our mysterious intruder. The really creepy part was that they never triggered our alarm system, like they knew exactly how to avoid detection completely. They ignored the cash registers, expensive equipment, and even left our safe completely untouched every single time they broke in somehow. The thief seemed to have supernatural knowledge about which burgers were the freshest, always taking the most recently prepared ones available. Some employees started whispering that maybe we were dealing with a ghost or some other kind of supernatural entity haunting us. The idea didn't seem so crazy after months of failed attempts to catch this impossible intruder who defied all logic. We tried everything from extra locks to motion sensors, but nothing worked to stop our persistent and seemingly supernatural burger bandit. Management brought in security consultants who were completely baffled by how someone could bypass all our upgraded prevention systems so easily. Then one day, after months of nightly burger thefts, the mysterious break-ins just suddenly stopped without any explanation or warning. To this day, nobody knows who or what was stealing our burgers, leaving us with an unsolved mystery that still haunts me. Alright, folks, buckle up because I'm about to tell you a story that'll make you think twice about your next shopping trip. This whole nightmare unfolded over several months, and it all started during what should have been just routine trips to my local Target. Every single time I walked into that store, without fail, I'd spot this same guy lurking somewhere in the background watching me. Now here is where it gets really creepy. This dude was always dressed completely in black from head to toe like some kind of shadow. But the detail that really freaked me out was that he constantly wore a ski mask, covering his entire face except for his eyes. Keep in mind we're talking about a warm climate area where it is sunny most of the year, definitely not ski mask weather at all. At first, I convinced myself it was probably just some bizarre coincidence, maybe we just happened to shop at similar times regularly. But then my gut started telling me something was seriously wrong, so I decided to pay closer attention to his movements and patterns. That is when I realized this wasn't random at all. This guy was definitely deliberately following me around the entire store every single visit. He'd put on this whole act of pretending to shop, picking up random products and examining them like a normal customer would do. But no matter which section I went to, whether it was electronics, clothing, or groceries, he'd somehow always end up there too. When I'd head to the electronics section, suddenly he needed to browse headphones right near me. It was becoming way too obvious. The whole situation was escalating and frankly terrifying me, so I made the decision to start shopping at a completely different Target location. I never encountered that creepy masked stalker again after switching stores, which basically confirmed my worst fears about being deliberately targeted at that location. Let me tell you about the kind of workplace nightmare that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. When I was working at Target, there was this one customer who started showing up way too regularly, always looking for me specifically. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, but then he started asking me really personal and inappropriate questions constantly. This guy would bombard me with questions about my personal life, where I lived, and even tried finding out my work schedule. I knew something was seriously wrong when he started timing his visits perfectly with my shifts, like he was tracking me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to report this escalating harassment to my manager and upper management immediately. But management basically told me their hands were tied unless this creep actually did something physically threatening or violent first. That response from management left me feeling completely vulnerable and unprotected while I was just trying to do my job safely. Then came the day that changed everything and proved my fears were completely justified about this dangerous stalker customer. After finishing my shift that evening, I walked out to the parking lot completely unaware that he had been waiting. This psycho had actually followed me outside and cornered me at my car, demanding that I go somewhere with him. When I refused and tried to get away, he completely lost it and physically grabbed my arm to stop me. Thank God there were other people around because someone saw what was happening and immediately called store security for help. Security banned him permanently from the store, but the whole terrifying experience left me completely shaken and traumatized for months. Picture this, you're leaving Target after a long day thinking you're safe, but sometimes the parking lot holds terrors you never saw coming. It was one of those late evenings when most people had already gone home, and the parking lot felt eerily quiet and deserted. As I walked out of the store, I immediately noticed this guy pushing a shopping cart, but something about him felt completely wrong. The first red flag was that his shopping cart was completely empty, like he hadn't actually bought anything from the store at all. Instead of heading toward any specific vehicle, this creep was just aimlessly wandering around the parking lot pushing that empty cart everywhere. My gut instincts kicked in immediately and I realized this guy wasn't shopping at all, but was actually following me through the lot. The more I walked toward my car, the more obvious it became that he was deliberately matching my pace and direction. When I finally reached my car and started fumbling for my keys, that is when this psycho suddenly picked up his pace dramatically. I could hear his footsteps getting faster and the shopping cart wheels squeaking louder as he rushed directly toward me and my vehicle. Thank God, I managed to get inside my car quickly and immediately slammed down all the door locks before he could reach me. But this maniac didn't give up and actually came right up to my car, aggressively trying to yank open the door handles. When that didn't work, he started tapping and then pounding on my car window, trying to get my attention or intimidate me. I laid on my horn as loud as possible and quickly reversed out of there, hoping to attract attention and escape. As I drove away and looked back in my rearview mirror, he was just standing there motionless, watching me leave like some kind of predator. You know what they say about pizza delivery being dangerous, but nothing really prepares you for the moment it becomes your reality. I was working another typical evening shift for Domino's when I got what seemed like just another routine delivery order to process. The address looked normal enough on paper, just like any other house delivery I'd done hundreds of times before in this area. But when I actually arrived at the location, something was immediately and obviously wrong with this whole setup from the start. Instead of finding a normal house with a front door, I was staring at this completely deserted parking lot behind some buildings. I figured maybe I'd made a mistake with the address, so I called the customer to clarify the correct location immediately. The guy on the phone calmly told me he would just come out to meet me right there in that exact parking lot. That should have been my first major red flag, but I was young and naive about these kinds of dangerous situations. A few minutes later, I spotted these two guys in dark hoodies walking directly toward my car from the shadows. One of them approached my driver's side window and asked if I was the pizza delivery guy they had ordered from. The moment I confirmed I was their delivery driver, both guys simultaneously started reaching inside their jacket pockets for something. My survival instincts kicked in immediately, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding away without looking back or stopping. I called the police right away to report the attempted robbery, and they confirmed my worst fears about the situation. The cops told me there had been multiple similar incidents where delivery drivers were being lured and robbed in that area. Sometimes the most innocent delivery orders turn into your worst nightmare, and this is one story that'll make you think twice. I was working my usual delivery shift when I got what looked like a perfectly normal takeout order to a residential address. The GPS led me to this quiet suburban street, but something felt wrong the moment I pulled up to the house. There was a big for sale sign planted right in the front yard, and the house looked completely abandoned and empty. No lights were on inside, the curtains were all drawn, and there were no cars in the driveway or garage area. I figured there must be some mistake with the address, so I called the customer number to clarify the situation. The voice on the phone claimed they were doing renovation work inside and told me to leave the food order there. He specifically instructed me to just set the bags by the front door and walk away without knocking or waiting. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was seriously wrong with this whole delivery setup and request from the customer. I decided to trust my gut feeling and drove straight back to the restaurant with the food order still intact. Later that same evening, my coworker received the exact same order to that identical address and decided to complete the delivery. When he arrived and approached the front door with the food, several guys suddenly jumped out from the bushes. They robbed him of everything, including the food, his wallet, and his phone before disappearing into the night completely. The police explained these criminals were using fake food orders to lure drivers to empty houses for easy robberies. Late-night food delivery can take you to some pretty sketchy places, but this DoorDash run turned into something way worse. I was working the graveyard shift when I got an order that would take me deep into the industrial district. The pickup went smooth enough, just another late-night restaurant grabbing their final orders before closing time for the evening. But as I drove deeper into the warehouse district, the streets got darker and more deserted with every turn. The GPS finally led me to this massive warehouse building that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were absolutely no cars in the parking lot, no lights visible anywhere, and the place felt completely dead. I tried calling the customer multiple times, but kept getting sent straight to voicemail with no response whatsoever. I was seriously considering just leaving with the food when something caught my attention in an upper window. There was definitely movement up there, like someone was walking around inside that supposedly abandoned warehouse building after all. Then I started hearing what sounded like multiple voices having some kind of heated conversation or argument inside. Every single instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there immediately before something terrible happened. I threw the car in reverse and sped away from that warehouse as fast as my engine could take me. The next morning, I did some research and discovered that warehouse was connected to serious criminal activity in the area. Multiple people had reportedly gone missing near that location, and police suspected it was being used for drug operations.